It is Good Friday, and on Good Friday, it is the tradition of much of the universal global church to meditate on the passion of Christ. By passion, I'm using the definition of the word passion that really means suffer. Suffer. Passion can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people. In some cases, for some people, passion refers to some internal sort of longing for something else in a wonderfully good way. We're passionate about certain things. That's fantastic. But another meaning of the word passion really is simply suffer. So the passion of the Christ refers to the suffering of Jesus. And why do we do this? Why do we concentrate on this moment? I understand that to someone outside of the church, it might look like what we're doing is we're focusing on some sort of terrible, horrible events and we're just kind of fixated on death and all of these sorts of things, but it's exactly the opposite. We concentrate on the reality that Jesus suffers. And as Christians, we believe that Jesus is the manifestation of God. And it leads us to understand that God suffers. And why does God suffer? That's where the word compassion comes in. Suffer with. To be compassionate is to be willing to suffer with someone, to walk with them through their pain. You know people who have been compassionate. You are compassionate. You have been willing to take upon yourself other people's suffering so that they don't have to carry it alone. As we consider then the story of the passion of the Christ or the compassion of God, what we're realizing is that in this entire story, we watch as God makes the decision in Jesus to join us in our suffering, all of our suffering, to join us in the suffering that comes from the moments in our lives when we are betrayed, to consider what it means that Jesus joins us in those moments in which we are falsely accused. That God is going to go through all of these things in Jesus precisely because that's what you and I have to go through in our lives. There are lots of ways to meditate on the passion of Christ. But for me, and at least for this moment, I wish to meditate on the idea that God has decided to join humanity in our suffering. Not so that we can stay there and wallow in it, but that God is walking us through all of it. Right? Not just betrayal and not just denials and not just mocking and not just the unfair trial. He goes through all of that sort of thing. But even into our moments of death, even to our moments where we are tempted to say, my God, why have you forsaken me? That God has decided to walk us all the way through every one of those experiences in our lives and then lead us into our resurrection. As we now share in the story of Christ's passion, I would encourage you to hear the story of Christ as your own story and to recognize that at every moment in your life where you have believed or that you have been tempted to believe that you are loaded down and that you are carrying burdens that are too big for you to bear alone, remember the passion of the Christ and that God never intends for you to carry those burdens by yourself. That God has joined you in all of your suffering so that God can lead you into your resurrection. That is the passion of the Christ, and that is the overwhelming compassion of God for you and me. And it serves maybe as a model for the way that we live and love and treat others. So now, the passion of the Christ. This is a reading from the Gospel of St. Luke, the 23rd chapter. Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said, "He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, from Galilee, where he began, even to this place." When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people, and said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting the people, and here I have examined him in your presence and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted out together, "Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us!" This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city, and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting, "Crucify! Crucify him!" A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, and the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder, and he handed Jesus over as they wished. As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him and made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" Two others who were criminals were led away to be put to death with Jesus. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing. And the people stood by watching, but the leaders scoffed at him, saying, "He saved others, let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one." The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying, "If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself." There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews." One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding Jesus and saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other rebuked him, saying, "Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong." Then he said, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." And he replied, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 in the afternoon, while the sun's light failed. And in the curtain of the temple, the curtain was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying out with a loud voice, saying, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. And when the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly this man was innocent." And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance, watching these things.